the 30th of May, 1918. Château-Thierry, France. The Marne River. The air is thick with a stench that is a mix of cordite, fear, and the sweat of a desperate retreat. French General Henri de Goutte watches from the rear echelon, his face a mask of exhaustion and despair. The German artillery barrage, a hurricane that began days ago on the Chemin des Dames, has pulverized the 6th Army's sector, driving veteran French colonial and metropolitan units backward in a route not seen since the war's opening months. The tide of the mighty German spring offensive Operation Blücher-York is a ravenous, unstoppable flood. Its vanguard now only 40 miles from Paris, the heart of the Republic. As demoralized French poilus stream past, muttering of a lost cause, an incongruous sight arrives. Trucks overloaded with massive, ill-fitting soldiers, in new, rough-cut uniforms, the American Expeditionary Forces AEF. They look like schoolboys playing soldier. A French officer, mud-caked and shaking, offers them the only advice he has left. Everything is collapsing. You must turn back. But what no one could believe was the response. A shocking contradiction to 4 years of European trench fatalism, a refusal to surrender ground, spoken by a simple Marine captain. Retreat? Hell, we just got here. This moment of reckless, unseasoned defiance laughed at by Allied commanders was the forgotten pivot point that changed the war. The arrival of the American Expeditionary Forces in 1917 was not heralded by triumph, but by deep-seated skepticism from their British and French allies. For over 3 years, the war on the Western Front had been defined by the monstrous, static logic of the trenches, a system of brutal, grinding attrition measured in yards and thousands of lives. The Allied High Command had come to believe in this war of position, where experience was measured by survival in the mud, and the Americans, they judged, had none. At the head of this nascent American army stood General John J. Black Jack Pershing, a cavalryman, an officer forged not in the massive mechanized battles of Europe, but in the small, sharp, mobile conflicts of the American West and the Philippines. Pershing arrived with an absolute, non-negotiable directive from President Woodrow Wilson. The AEF would fight as a unified, independent American army. This insistence was a political and strategic earthquake that infuriated the Allied generals. British Field Marshal Sir Douglas Haig and French General Philippe Pétain saw the arriving Americans not as an army, but as a pool of desperately needed replacements, green, physically fit bodies to be spoon-fed into their depleted, veteran units in a process known as amalgamation. To the French, who had bled white since 1914, Pershing's refusal seemed like rank amateurism, a suicidal gamble motivated by national vanity. They were masters of trenchcraft, camouflage, and the grim calculus of the defensive barrage. The Americans, in contrast, arrived preaching the doctrine of open warfare. This was not the positional trench fighting of the Allies, but a call back to a more aggressive, mobile style of battle, emphasizing superior rifle marksmanship, aggressive bayonet charges, and a non-stop offensive spirit designed to exploit breakthroughs rather than settle into sieges. French officers sneered, viewing it as hopelessly naive, a childish fantasy in the face of the German 77mm field gun and the omnipresent heavy machine gun. Pershing stood firm, enduring the relentless political and personal pressure. He knew that to amalgamate the AEF would be to pour the new wine into old bottles to infect his eager but raw army with the defensive paralysis that gripped the Allied command. He envisioned an American force that would restore the maneuver to a war that had become a slaughterhouse. His staff officers were meticulous in their planning, often sketching offensive objectives far beyond the scope considered possible by their allies. They believed that the key was the aggressiveness of the American soldier, a fresh psychological factor the war-weary Europeans had lost. Yet, by the spring of 1918, the Germans, having neutralized the Eastern Front, had unleashed Operation Michael, followed by Operation Blücher-York. This last-ditch, massive offensive, spearheaded by hardened German stormtroopers and utilizing a devastating surprise artillery barrage, tore a hole 50 miles wide in the French lines. It was a terrifying reintroduction of mobility to the Western Front, but not by the Americans. It was the German Kaiser's army that was moving again, and they were moving directly toward Paris. In the face of this existential crisis, Pershing, though maintaining his ultimate goal, made a monumental offer to the newly appointed Allied Generalissimo, General Ferdinand Foch, I have come to tell you that the American people would consider it a great honor for our troops to be engaged in the present battle. All that we have is yours. Use them as you wish. This offer, though a temporary, desperate concession to the principle of joint action, was the moment American troops were suddenly rushed into the gaping hole in the line not as a perfectly prepared army, but as a fire brigade thrown into the inferno. Their first real test was not a planned offensive, but a desperate, pell-mell defense on the very banks of the Marne River, in a town called Château-Thierry. The survival of the Western Alliance now rested on the backs of the troops the French generals had quietly mocked for months. Their scorn was about to be violently, irrevocably shattered by the sound of American Springfield rifles. The sheer speed and scale of the German advance, which had covered nearly 40 miles in 4 days during late May 1918, had outrun their own supply lines, but it had also shattered the Allied psychological resolve. The French Sixth Army was broken, its reserve divisions rushing to plug the 70-mile gap between Soissons and Reims. By May 30th, the crisis was centered on the small, strategic town of Château-Thierry, where the main road to Paris crossed the Marne River. If the Germans secured the Marne bridges, the road to the capital was wide open. Into this maelstrom, on the night of May 30th, rolled the vanguard of the American Fire Brigade, elements of the U.S. 3rd Infantry Division. These were not the fresh, enthusiastic doughboys of public imagination, but the regular American Army. Professional soldiers rushed forward from their training areas. They arrived to find utter chaos. Exhausted, defeated French poilus were pouring south across the Marne bridges, often without officers, abandoning equipment, their faces etched with the terror of the German stormtroopers. The French generals, viewing the position as utterly lost, were preparing to blow the bridges and retreat further south. The commander of the American machine gunners, Major Jesse Woolridge McAlexander, was ordered to support the French rear guard. He deployed his 7th Machine Gun Battalion units, armed with the heavy, water-cooled Browning M 1917 machine gun on the south bank of the Marne, overlooking the bridges. His orders were to cover the French retreat, but the morale around him was toxic. As French General Jean-Marie Degout ordered the final, planned demolition of the bridges, the young, green-uniformed American soldiers simply refused to participate in the general panic. The next morning, May 31st, the German spearhead battle-hardened infantry regiments advanced into the northern, defenseless half of Château-Thierry. Their initial progress was swift, but as the Germans approached the main bridge, preparing to cross, they were met not with the scattered, desperate fire of a retreating army, but with an unrelenting, concentrated sheet of lead. McAlexander's machine gunners, positioned skillfully in windows and ruins on the southern bank, laid down interlocking fields of fire. The noise was terrifying, the fire rate shocking. The German infantry, trained to exploit gaps and push through thin lines, were accustomed to their enemy retreating under heavy fire. They were not accustomed to an enemy refusing to fall back. The accuracy of the American riflemen and the sheer volume of the heavy Browning guns stalled the German advance cold on the bridgehead. Every attempt to rush the crossing was met with a devastating hail of machine gun fire. This was not the timid, calculated defense of the war-weary French and British. This was an aggressive, almost reckless volume of fire that spoke of inexhaustible ammunition and unwavering resolve. The French, watching in stunned silence from their rear positions, witnessed the impossible. These new, raw troops, the very men they had sought to break up and absorb, were holding a position that hours earlier had been considered forfeit. When the French engineers finally did blow the main bridge, it was less a sign of retreat and more a formalization of the American stand. The U.S. 3rd Division, which would earn the nickname the Rock of the Marne, held the line against repeated German efforts to ford the river or cross the ruins of the bridge for the next 2 weeks. Château-Thierry was saved, and the most immediate, terrifying threat to Paris was arrested, not by Allied strategy, but by sheer American, unyielding tenacity. The scorn was beginning to give way to a flicker of astonished respect. The action at Château-Thierry was a staunch defense, but just a few miles northwest, in a dense, sinister hunting preserve known as Bois de Belleau, Belleau Wood. The next wave of American troops was about to unleash the aggressive, open warfare doctrine Pershing had championed, paying for it in a bloody, unforgettable baptism. On June 1st, 1918, the Germans, having been repulsed at the Marne River crossing, redirected their focus. Their next objective was to secure the high ground around the village of Belleau and the adjacent wood, consolidating their salient dangerously close to the Paris-Metz highway. Into this sector moved the U.S. 2nd Infantry Division, which included the legendary 4th Marine Brigade. These were the United States Marines, fighting as part of the Army's divisional structure, a situation unique to the Great War. As the Marines moved forward, they encountered the same disheartening sight that had met the 3rd Division, French troops in full retreat. A French officer, directing traffic, urged the incoming American column to fall back and establish a defensive line well to the rear. It was here that Captain Lloyd Williams of the 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines, delivered the line that would become immortal in Marine Corps history. "Retreat! Hell, we just got here." It was a statement of raw, unvarnished confidence, incomprehensible to the war-shattered European mindset. The battle began in earnest on June 6th. The French Corps commander, convinced the woods were only lightly held, ordered the Americans to take the position. However, the German High Command had already heavily fortified Belleau Wood. It was occupied by elements of the 237th, 10th, and 197th German divisions, who had transformed the mile-square, rocky terrain into a veritable fortress, a maze of hidden machine gun nests, sniper positions, and thickets of barbed wire, all shielded by the dense, unforgiving woods. The initial Marine assault was a disaster born of inexperience and poor Allied intelligence. The 4th Brigade attacked across open, exposed wheat fields toward the wood line in broad daylight, using formations that were tragically dense and conspicuous. The German machine gunners, lying in wait, opened up with the dreaded high cyclic rate MG-08 machine gun, tearing through the ranks. In that single, terrible first day, the 4th Marine Brigade suffered 1,087 casualties, the highest single-day loss in the Corps' 143-year history up to that point. Captain Williams himself was among the fallen, killed shortly after his famed declaration. Yet, despite the appalling losses, the Marines did not break. Where other troops, following the logic of attrition, might have recoiled, the Americans, fueled by the open warfare doctrine and a refusal to be pinned down, pushed forward into the darkness of the wood, engaging the Germans in brutal hand-to-hand combat. They used bayonets, trench knives, and their M1903 Springfield rifles with an accuracy and aggression that stunned the veteran German defenders. The battle for Belleau Wood would drag on for 3 harrowing weeks, becoming a close-quarters, savage struggle for every foot of shattered, shell-pocked terrain. This was the moment the AEF shed its amateur status and proved its shocking, costly mettle. The grim, desperate fighting inside Belleau Wood was unlike anything the veteran German infantry had experienced in their 4 years on the Western Front. For the Germans, the Allied soldier had become predictable. They fought defensively. Their attacks were heralded by overwhelming, hours-long artillery preparations, and when they suffered high casualties, they generally fell back to consolidate. The Americans, however, defied this brutal yet familiar logic. Within the dense, rocky confines of the Bois de Belleau, the combat dissolved into a series of short, furious engagements. The Americans, particularly the Marines, employed the aggressive tactics Pershing had mandated, non-stop forward movement, and a relentless belief in individual marksmanship and the bayonet. They charged machine gun nests directly, using fire and maneuver that the French had long since abandoned in favor of static shelling. The Germans, hidden in rock crevices and deep dugouts, were forced into an alien style of combat close in, brutal wrestling matches among the shattered trees. The German defenders were units mostly comprised of trench divisions, formations intended to hold ground, not fight mobile, aggressive battles against fresh, highly motivated troops. Their officers were aghast at the American style. German doctrine emphasized holding the line and launching carefully prepared counterattacks. The Americans, in contrast, seemed to attack, absorb shattering losses, and then simply attack again, often without waiting for supporting artillery or coordinated flanking maneuvers. This reckless, costly, yet continuous forward pressure was psychologically devastating. In their combat reports, the German officers began to refer to the American Marines with a mixture of disbelief and grudging respect. It is during this battle that the famous German nickname, the Teufelhunden, or Devil Dogs, is reputed to have originated, meant to describe the Marines' ferocity, their refusal to break under fire, and their bayonet charges through machine gun lanes. While the exact origin of the phrase remains debated, its essence captured the profound shock the German army experienced. The Americans possessed a fresh psychological resilience that the war-weary Europeans, both Allied and German, had long since lost. This psychological factor was arguably more important than the tactical victory. For the first time in the 1918 spring offensives, the German troops were meeting an enemy who did not know how to retreat and did not know how to surrender ground. The German High Command, which had gambled everything on defeating the Allies before the full weight of the AEF could be brought to bear, now received grim reports that spoke not just of casualties, but of a new, terrifying breed of opponent. The American refusal to quit at Château-Thierry and their stubborn, bloody conquest of Belleau Wood, which was finally secured on the 26th of June 1918, sent a clear message echoing through the German lines. The war of attrition was over, and the clock was ticking against them. The injection of over 8,000 casualties into the American ranks during this single battle sector was tragic, but the cost proved to be the purchase price of victory. The American amateurs had proven they were something far worse to face than seasoned veterans. They were relentless. While the infantry and Marines were fighting for their lives in the mud and shattered rock of the Marne sector, General John J. Pershing was engaged in an equally vital, though quieter, struggle, the political battle to preserve the independent integrity of the American expeditionary forces. The staggering successes of the German spring offensives, which had seen the Allies lose hundreds of thousands of men and threatened to sever the British and French armies, intensified the Allied clamor for amalgamation. British Prime Minister David Lloyd George and French Premier Georges Clemenceau, witnessing the crisis, renewed their demands for the immediate integration of American soldiers, at the company or battalion level, into their decimated divisions. Their argument was pragmatic. American officers were too green, American logistical support was still rudimentary, and the war was too desperate to wait for Pershing's vision of a fully formed American army. The soldiers were needed now as replacements. Pershing stood like an immovable monument against this pressure. He saw the demand not just as an insult to American prestige, but as a strategic error. He believed amalgamation would simply dilute the fresh, offensive spirit he was trying to instill, spreading his troops thin across the demoralized, defensively minded Allied line. His goal was not merely to help the Allies hold the line, but to field an army capable of striking a decisive, war-winning blow. His resolute stance was a profound political risk. At one point, facing immense pressure from Allied Generalissimo Ferdinand Foch, Pershing is said to have declared that he would rather see the Allied line fall back to the Loire River, meaning the loss of Paris, than sacrifice the cohesion and potential of the AEF. This was not arrogance. It was a deep, uncompromising faith in his doctrine of open warfare and the untapped potential of the American soldier. He gambled that the momentary tactical losses of delay were worth the ultimate strategic gain of an independent, highly mobile army capable of maneuver and exploitation. The temporary success of the Americans at Château-Thierry and Belleau Wood provided Pershing with the essential ammunition he needed to win this political war. The actions of the 2nd and 3rd Divisions, even while operating under French operational command, demonstrated that American troops were not merely cannon fodder. They possessed a unique fighting quality that should not be squandered in piecemeal fashion. The reports detailing the Marines' ferocity provided undeniable evidence that the new American fighting spirit, aggressive, forward-moving, and relentless, was the antithesis of the static, shell-shocked doctrine that had defined the war for 4 years. Foch, seeing the momentum shifting and recognizing the morale boost the concentrated American presence provided, began to relent. Pershing secured his objective. The AEF would remain an American army, commanded by American officers, eventually deployed on its own sector of the front. This was the silent, crucial victory that paved the way for the massive American offensives that would follow, including the Street Mihil and Meuse-Argonne campaigns. The Rock of the Marne and the Devil Dogs had given Pershing the evidence he needed to prove that the Americans were best used as an intact, independent force, a decisive weight, not merely a filler for depleted ranks. With the German drive checked at the Marne and the capture of the crucial high ground at Belleau Wood secured, the crisis of the German spring offensives began to dissipate. The cost to the German army was staggering, both in manpower and morale. Operation Blücher York had created a massive, exposed salient, a deep bulge in the Allied line that was difficult for the Germans to supply and defend. The American intervention had successfully denied the Germans the quick, decisive victory they desperately needed before the full weight of the U.S. industrial and military mobilization could reach Europe. This halting of the German surge provided the essential breathing room for the Allies to transition from a desperate defense to a coordinated counteroffensive. Generalissimo Foch, galvanized by the demonstrated resilience of the AEF and the failure of the final German thrusts, began planning the Second Battle of the Marne. This offensive, launched on the 18th of July, 1918, was the moment the strategic momentum of the Great War shifted decisively. The AEF, now a tested force, was given a prominent role in the counterattack, participating alongside veteran French units in the operation to eliminate the Marne salient. American troops from the 1st and 2nd Divisions were thrown into the offensive near Soissons, attacking the western flank of the German bulge. This attack was characterized by the same aggressive, open warfare tactics that had marked their earlier defensive battles, but this time they were on the offense. The 1st Division's assault, though costly, was a stunning tactical success. Launching a surprise attack without the massive, hours-long preliminary bombardment that signaled every Allied offensive for 4 years, the doughboys followed a short, intense rolling barrage. They crashed through the German defensive lines, advancing 4 miles in a single day and capturing thousands of prisoners and vast quantities of matériel. This kind of rapid, deep penetration was revolutionary on the Western Front, where advances were normally measured in hundreds of yards. The sheer speed of the American advance surprised not only the Germans but also the skeptical Allied commanders. The relentless forward push created chaos in the German rear. Supply lines were cut, command structures fractured, and the German reserve divisions, already exhausted and demoralized from the spring offensives, were unable to stabilize the front. The aggressive American style moving forward regardless of flanking fire or scattered enemy resistance exploited the deep rot in the German army's morale. The German troops, who had been promised swift victory, now faced an endless stream of fresh, highly motivated opponents who seemed to ignore the basic rules of modern trench warfare. The combined Allied counteroffensive, sparked by the successful American and French actions around the Marne, confirmed the fears of the German High Command. General Erich Ludendorff, the architect of the spring offensive, later referred to July 18th as the Black Day of the German Army, not because of the land lost, but because the collapse of troop morale and the proven effectiveness of the rapidly arriving American power finally revealed that the war was irrevocably lost. The aggressive spirit that the French generals had laughed at only weeks before had proven to be the critical ingredient necessary to turn the tide. The American performance at Château-Thierry and Belleau would provided the essential momentum and morale needed to transition the Allies into the final war-winning phase. The 100 Days Offensive that began in August 1918. By this point, the initial skepticism of the French and British high commands had been replaced by a ravenous appetite for more American divisions. The American fighting man had proven to be the decisive element of freshness, drive, and seemingly limitless reserves of energy. The logistics of getting American men and materiel to the front, however, was a triumph of engineering and administration, led by Pershing's meticulous staff. The AEF had overcome the massive infrastructural challenge of shipping millions of tons of supplies and over 2 million men across the Atlantic, then establishing training camps, hospitals, and supply depots across France, all necessary to support an independent army. This logistical feat, often overlooked, was as critical as the courage on the battlefield. By late summer, American divisions were arriving at the front at an astonishing rate of up to 250,000 men per month, providing the numerical superiority the Allies had lacked for years. In September, General Pershing finally realized his ambition of commanding a wholly independent American field army, the 1st U.S. Army. This army, comprised of 500,000 men, immediately executed the Street-Mihil offensive, an operation planned and led entirely by American officers, proving their operational capability. Although the Germans were already in the process of withdrawing from the salient, the rapid, decisive American advance captured in less than 4 days with minimal casualties compared to the scale of the operation was a massive boost to Allied confidence and a major blow to German prestige. This victory set the stage for the final, brutal American engagement, the Meuse-Argonne Offensive, launched on the 26th of September 1918. This was the most colossal and complex operation in U.S. military history up to that point, involving over 1 million American troops fighting through dense forests, difficult terrain, and the formidable defenses of the Hindenburg Line. The German army, though reeling, fought stubbornly. Casualties were immense, reflecting the AEF's initial inexperience in large-scale maneuver and the continued use of costly frontal assaults. Yet, the core lesson learned at Château-Thierry, relentlessness, carried the day. Despite setbacks, logistical snarls, and severe losses, over 26,000 American dead and 95,000 wounded in the 47-day battle, the American advance never truly stopped. The sheer, continuous pressure of the enormous fresh American army, combined with the successful coordinated attacks by the French, British, and Belgian armies across the entire Western Front, finally broke the German will to fight. The German soldiers were utterly exhausted. Their supplies were gone, and they could no longer ignore the new factor in the war, as their own commanders called the AEF. The arrival of the Americans had not just stopped a German drive. It had provided the decisive, unstoppable momentum that led directly to the armistice on the 11th of November, 1918. The laugh of the French generals had become the death knell of the German Empire. The intervention of the American Expeditionary Forces in 1918, beginning with the desperate defensive stands at Château-Thierry and the costly conquest of Belleau Wood, proved that the new American soldier possessed the psychological drive and aggressive tactics necessary to break the 4-year stalemate. By demonstrating that continuous forward movement was still possible, a core tenet of Pershing's open warfare doctrine, the AEF not only helped halt the final German offensive, but provided the critical manpower and morale infusion that enabled the decisive Allied counteroffensives. The arrival of the American infantry transformed the conflict from a war of grinding attrition into a war of maneuver, ultimately accelerating the end of the Great War by months, if not a year. The final lesson of Château-Thierry and Belleau Wood is that warfare is as much about will and perception as it is about ordnance and experience. The German army, undefeated in the field and masters of trench warfare, broke when faced with an enemy that defied their expected psychology of surrender and exhaustion. It was a lesson in the immense power of fresh, unrelenting determination, overwhelming entrenched, weary cynicism. If you want to delve deeper into the personal stories of the American soldiers and Marines who were thrust into this pivotal moment, or explore how the Meuse-Argonne campaign finally broke the Hindenburg Line, let me know.